Hey friend, welcome to Ask Dr. Betters. You know, some of the more heartbreaking questions I get revolve around marriage. Marriage and family issues are really, really tough to deal with because each one is so different. There's no one set cookie cutter way, although there are biblical principles to follow to make for a good marriage. So Kathleen wants to know, what do you do if your spouse isn't religious? Well, first thing I'll tell you is you're in trouble. Marrying the right person is the second most important decision you'll ever make in your life. But marrying the wrong person can lead to a life of disaster and uncertainty and questions and even ridicule at times. If you are married to a man who is not a believer, the scripture gives you very specific advice. It doesn't leave you blind. It doesn't leave you without an answer to this question. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, it says in verse 10, "To the married I give this charge, that the wife should not separate from the husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." Well, the question that was being raised by the Corinthian believers to the Apostle Paul was, well, I've become a Christian. My friends, my relatives, my parents, everybody around me has become a Christian, except my husband. My husband wants nothing to do with it. He wants to stay separate from any kind of commitment to Jesus Christ. So, for all intents and purposes, he's not religious. What do? I look around and I see many of my unsaved friends ending up in divorce court, divorcing their spouses, then remarrying and finding peace and love for the very first time. Isn't that also what I'm entitled to? Well, Paul goes on, he says this. He says, you should remain unmarried or be reconciled to your husband. There should be no divorce between you and your husband. To the rest I say that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, that means he's a Christian, she's not, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, that seems to be your case, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. For in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. And here's the key now. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, I know that passage can become very confusing, so I'm going to try to break it down for you as quickly as I can. If you are the unbeliever living in this marriage, and your husband is a believer, or vice versa, if you are the believer living in a unbelieving marriage, you are the only contact that person may ever have to the gospel. That's what he means when he says, how do you know, O wife, whether you will not sanctify your husband or bring your husband into context of a relationship where he will see and hear and experience your relationship to Christ firsthand. In other words, you are the only link in that home to biblical salvation. You're the only link to your husband, and you're the only link to your children. So Paul throws out the possibility that if you walk out of the marriage, if you divorce the marriage, you lose all hope of ever sanctifying the marriage or bringing the marriage into a relationship with Jesus Christ. So you are, as the believer, you are the sanctifying influence in the home. That's why God hates divorce. We give him no opportunity to save that husband, to save that wife. You know, the church is littered with testimonies of people who gave up too soon, who gave up on their spouses way too soon, and who have chosen to live lives outside of the bonds of marriage just because it's more convenient that way. So study 1 Corinthians chapter 6, study the passage of Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 and following, and you will find that God makes no allowance for quickie divorces. Yes, he does allow on grounds of abuse or adultery or things like that, but he makes no easy grounds for you to just pack up your bags and walk out of the marriage. Study it, and I know God will encourage you with it. Hope this helps.
Hi, my name is Melissa Weisenfels, Executive Director here at MARKINC Ministries. Thank you so very much for your continued support of this video series. Ask Dr. Betters is not meant to be a substitute for professional counseling, but instead is designed to extract biblical principles around the questions being asked. We encourage you to seek professional counseling if needed.